It all started one quiet evening in Westwood, Los Angeles. The sun had just dipped behind the hills, casting a long shadow over the neighborhood. The fading orange light from the sunset mixed with the cool, crisp air that started to creep in. The streets of Westwood, known for their clean, well-kept lawns and elegant homes, seemed as calm as ever. The gentle hum of traffic could still be heard in the distance, yet there was a stillness that felt different, something that didn't quite fit with the usual peaceful atmosphere of this upscale part of the city. People were walking their dogs, kids were playing in the yards, and couples strolled through the streets, wrapped in quiet conversation or lost in their own thoughts. It looked like a typical night, almost picture-perfect. But there was a strange sensation that lingered beneath the surface, a subtle tension that crept up from the very ground itself, radiating in every direction. The sun had set, but the air still held a strange warmth, one that didn't belong. It was almost as if the neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As the hours passed and the sky deepened into the velvet blues and blacks of night, an eerie calm settled over Westwood. There were no sudden sounds, no bursts of laughter from children, no car alarms, no dogs barking at passing strangers. The usual noises that filled the streets of Westwood seemed to be swallowed by an invisible force. Even the gentle rustling of the leaves in the trees seemed quieter than usual, as though the trees themselves were afraid to make a sound. It was unsettling. Everything was too still, too quiet. A few residents noticed it. One elderly woman, Mrs. Langston, who had lived in Westwood for decades, paused on her nightly walk, a frown creeping onto her face as she stared at the street ahead. It wasn't that she felt unsafe. It was more of a vague discomfort, a feeling she couldn't quite put into words. She had lived here long enough to know when something wasn't right. Her hands, clutching her cane a little tighter, trembled ever so slightly as she quickened her pace, eager to return to the comfort of her home. Across the street, at the Martinez house, Sophia, the teenage daughter, was sitting by her bedroom window, looking out at the empty street. She had been on her phone for hours, scrolling through social media, but something about the scene outside caught her attention. Her fingers stopped scrolling. The street light by the corner flickered once, then twice, casting a dim and almost sickly light on the sidewalk. Sophia had never really paid much attention to it before, but that street light, normally steady, seemed different tonight. It almost seemed like it was alive. But that was ridiculous, right? It was just a street light, after all. Yet there was something about the way the light flickered that made her feel uneasy, like something was trying to break free from the shadows and reach out. She shook her head, trying to shake off the feeling. After all, she was just a teenager. Nothing could be that bad, right? But she couldn't help it. Her eyes kept drifting back to the corner, where the streetlight now shone a little brighter than before. The shadows on the sidewalk stretched further than they should have, stretching like fingers, reaching out to grab something or someone. She quickly pulled away from the window, muttering to herself, but the unease didn't leave. At the corner of Westwood Boulevard and Warner Avenue, Derek, a young man in his 20s, walked briskly toward his apartment. He had just gotten off work, and the weight of the day was starting to catch up with him. His feet moved quicker, wanting to get home, relax, and forget about the long day. But as he passed the old ivy-covered building that had once been a store, his eyes caught a glimpse of movement inside. A flash of something dark, like a shadow passing by the window. He stopped, his heart skipping a beat, and turned his head to look. Nothing. The window was empty. He frowned, feeling a bit ridiculous. It was probably just his tired eyes playing tricks on him. He had been working late again, and stress was getting to him. But still, something didn't sit right. That building, old and empty for as long as he could remember, had never felt so alive. He shook his head, continuing on his way, but the unease lingered, following him like a weight. By now, nearly every resident of Westwood had experienced the strange sensation at some point that evening. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable at first, but it slowly crept into the minds of those who lived there. Something was wrong. The air felt thick, like it was holding something in, a dark secret waiting to be revealed. There was no rain, no wind, no noise, just the unsettling quiet that had taken over the once bustling neighborhood. As midnight neared, a soft wind began to blow, but it didn't bring the usual comfort of a cooling breeze. Instead, it felt like a warning, sharp and biting. A few of the street lights flickered again, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. The trees swayed as though whispering to each other, their branches creaking in a way that sounded almost human. The soft sound of leaves crunching underfoot became louder in the stillness, echoing down the empty streets like footsteps in the distance. Somewhere in the heart of the neighborhood, a window slammed shut, though no one had been nearby. A car alarm went off briefly, but no one could pinpoint where it came from. A dog barked in the distance, then went silent. The tension in the air grew thicker, suffocating the residents in its grip. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The streetlights returned to their steady glow. The wind died down, and the silence returned. But now, it was different. It was as if the neighborhood had been holding its breath for far too long, and had finally exhaled, leaving the residents with a feeling of dread that lingered long after the night had settled. That night, when the residents of Westwood finally drifted to sleep, they did so with the strange sensation that they were being watched, that they weren't alone. No one could explain it. No one could understand why the atmosphere felt so oppressive, so wrong. But they all felt it. The calm before the storm had passed, and now something dark was waiting, and it wasn't going to wait much longer. The following morning, as the sun rose and the city of Los Angeles began its daily grind, Westwood was still cloaked in that strange unease. The shadows seemed longer, more oppressive, and as the residents went about their daily routines, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the corner, just out of sight. The storm was coming, and no one knew how bad it was going to get. But they could feel it, the calm before the nightmare.
A few days after the strange events that swept through Westwood, things seemed to settle back into their usual rhythm. The fog that had crept through the streets began to lift, and the residents resumed their daily routines, though the strange feeling of unease still lingered in the air, like a shadow, following them wherever they went. But just when it seemed like the calm had returned, something happened that would forever change the neighborhood. It started as a regular morning, but soon the news spread through Westwood like wildfire. A local college student, Emily Harris, had gone missing. She was a bright, hard-working young woman who had grown up in Westwood and was attending UCLA. Emily had always been an active part of the community, a familiar face in the cafe she frequented on the corner of Westwood Boulevard. She had been seen by a friend just a few hours before her disappearance. They had shared coffee and laughed about trivial things like the stress of finals and her plans for the weekend. But after they parted ways, Emily had walked home alone, something she had done countless times before. It wasn't unusual. In fact, Westwood was known for being a safe neighborhood, one where parents didn't worry too much about their children walking home after dark. But that night, something had gone wrong. Emily never made it home. The first sign that something was off came from the police, who were alerted after Emily failed to check in with her family. They had called her several times, but her phone went straight to voicemail. Panic began to set in, and when Emily's roommate called around to see if anyone had heard from her, the truth became clear. No one had seen or heard from Emily since she had left the cafe. The police immediately began their search, canvassing the area, speaking to anyone who might have seen something unusual. But the more they dug into the case, the more confusing it became. No one had witnessed anything out of the ordinary. There were no reports of strange cars or suspicious individuals in the area. Emily had been walking down the familiar streets of Westwood, just like she always did, and yet there were no signs that anything had happened to her. It was as if she had just vanished. The neighborhood, so quiet and peaceful just a few days before, suddenly felt haunted by her absence. In the days that followed, the police scoured the streets, looking for any clue that might lead them to Emily. They reviewed security footage from nearby stores and cafes, but nothing showed up. No signs of a struggle, no strange movements. No one even remembered seeing her walk past. It was as if she had been swallowed by the very street she had lived on her entire life. The only clue that emerged was something so bizarre that it only deepened the mystery. One evening, a local resident, a man named Thomas, who lived on the corner of Westwood Boulevard, was walking his dog when he noticed something strange. He had passed the street lamp near the corner, the one that flickered on and off, and saw something that made his stomach turn. On the pole, just below the light, was a single, bloody handprint. It wasn't large, but it was unmistakable. red, dripping in the dim light. The blood was fresh. Thomas didn't know what to make of it at first. He assumed it was a prank, or perhaps a result of some accident. But as he stepped closer, a chill ran down his spine. The handprint was too deliberate, too vivid to be ignored. It wasn't just some random smear of blood. It was as if someone had placed their hand there intentionally, leaving behind a silent but eerie mark.
The police were called, and the area was cordoned off. Forensics arrived, but when they examined the handprint, they found no other evidence. No fingerprints, no fibers, nothing else that could explain its presence. The only thing that stood out was the fact that it was left on the street lamp right near the spot where Emily had been last seen. It was the strangest clue the police had uncovered, and it only added to the growing sense of unease that had settled over the community. The next few days brought more confusion and frustration. Despite intense searching, Emily remained missing. The usual channels of investigation, the things that worked in other cases, didn't seem to apply here. Her family, friends, and even the police could not explain where she had gone, or why there had been no trace of her. As far as anyone could tell, Emily had simply vanished. And the unsettling part? This wasn't the first time something like... As the police dug deeper into the neighborhood's history, they found something disturbing. They unearthed old records of disappearances, cases that had long since gone cold. A woman who had lived in the same area years earlier had gone missing in a similar fashion. Her name was Sarah, and she had been last seen walking home from a party, just like Emily. And much like Emily, there had been no signs of a struggle, no witnesses, no reason for her disappearance. It had been brushed off as an isolated incident at the time, but now, with Emily's case, the similarities were too uncanny to ignore. There were whispers among the locals, too. Some people claimed that strange things had been happening in Westwood for years. Things that no one wanted to talk about openly. Some said it was the land, the old, forgotten history of the neighborhood. Others whispered about a curse, a malevolent force that had been lurking in the shadows for decades, waiting for the right moment to strike. But these were just rumors. Stories passed down from generation to generation, fueled by fear and mystery. Nothing more. At least, that's what the rational-minded people of Westwood tried to believe. But as the days turned into weeks and the police were no closer to solving the case, the rumors began to spread faster. People began to talk more openly about the strange occurrences, the feeling of dread that seemed to hang over the neighborhood, the sense that something had changed, that something was watching them. Westwood was no longer the safe, quiet neighborhood it had been. It was as if something, someone, had stepped into the story and taken control. And the most terrifying part, no one knew who or what it was. As Emily's disappearance grew colder, so did the hearts of those who lived in Westwood. The once vibrant neighborhood began to feel empty, its beauty marred by fear. People started locking their doors earlier, walking the streets with a sense of urgency, and avoiding the areas where they knew things had happened. It was as if the very essence of the neighborhood had been tainted. Westwood, once a place of calm, had become a place of fear. And the question on everyone's mind remained unanswered. Where was Emily Harris? What had happened to her? Had she simply vanished? Or was something far darker at work in the shadows of Westwood? Days passed, and the eerie silence that had plagued Westwood seemed to intensify. The community, once peaceful and filled with the hum of daily life, now felt more like a ghost town. There was an undeniable sense of dread that hung in the air, making every corner, every shadow, seem just a little darker. The unease grew, creeping into the hearts and minds of the people who lived there. It was as if something insidious was lurking, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then that moment came. It started like any other evening, with the fading sun casting long shadows over the neighborhood. The streets were quieter than usual, with fewer people walking about. This strange, unsettling calm had taken over, making even the most mundane activities feel out of place. In the distance, the soft hum of cars could still be heard, but it wasn't the same. The normal noise of life seemed muted, as if the world had been turned down a few notches. As nightfall approached, a thick fog began to roll in. It crept down the streets, swallowing everything in its path, hiding the familiar houses and streetlights behind a blanket of white. The fog seemed to hold the night in a chokehold, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in front of you. The air was thick with dampness, the kind of moisture that made your skin crawl. It was the kind of fog that made it feel like you were walking through a dream or a nightmare. No one knows exactly what happened that night, but the events that unfolded changed Westwood forever. The first signs came in the form of strange noises. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the wind. But as the night grew darker, the sounds became louder, more distinct. Sobbing, frantic cries for help, muffled screams that seemed to echo through the fog, and the unmistakable sound of something heavy dragging along the pavement. The noises were not just unsettling, they were terrifying. Something was wrong, very wrong. As the sounds continued, some of the residents of Westwood began to venture outside, trying to make sense of what they were hearing. They stepped into the thick fog, their breaths shallow and quick, the tension rising with every step. But no one could pinpoint the source of the noises. The fog seemed to swallow everything, leaving only the sounds to guide them. The air was thick with fear, the oppressive silence between each scream. It wasn't long before a call came into the police. A woman, frantic and trembling, reported hearing the sounds coming from a house just a few blocks away from the center of Westwood. The authorities arrived quickly, their sirens cutting through the fog, but when they pulled up to the street, there was no sign of anyone, no sign of a struggle, no broken windows, nothing to suggest that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. But the air was thick with tension, and as they approached, the abandoned house at the end of the street, they saw something that made their blood run cold. A trail of blood led from the front yard to the door, its crimson hue stark against the fog. The blood was fresh, dripping slowly from somewhere inside the house, staining the concrete sidewalk as it pooled beneath the doorway. It was a chilling sight, one that immediately set off alarms in the officers' minds. They approached cautiously, weapons drawn, their breaths misting in the cold air. Every instinct told them something terrible had happened here. Something that would be far worse than anything they had encountered before.
They forced open the door, and what they found inside was beyond anything they could have imagined. The house, which had been empty for years, was now a scene of unspeakable horror. Multiple bodies were scattered across the floor, their once human forms disfigured in ways that made it impossible to recognize them. Some were twisted, bent at unnatural angles, while others were arranged in a disturbing pattern in the center of the room. Their faces were frozen in expressions of terror, their eyes wide and unblinking. The blood that had led the authorities inside pooled around the bodies, darkening the floorboards and creating an almost suffocating atmosphere.
The bodies were not the only thing that struck fear into the hearts of the police officers. There was something else, something that seemed to pulse in the air, an energy that felt alive, almost as if the house itself was breathing. The officers were hit with a feeling of dread so strong that it almost made them turn and run. They called for backup immediately, but deep down, they knew that whatever they had stumbled upon wasn't just another crime scene. This was something different, something far darker. As the authorities continued their investigation, more disturbing details began to surface. The victims were all residents of Westwood, people who had vanished without a trace in the days leading up to the massacre. They had all been part of the community, familiar faces in the neighborhood. Some were neighbors. Others were friends or acquaintances. But one thing became clear. They had all been taken, and they had all been subjected to unimaginable horrors before meeting their end. The disfigurements were the most shocking part. The bodies had been mutilated, their limbs twisted and broken in ways that seemed deliberate. It wasn't just random violence. It was as if the killer had taken their time, savoring each moment, each torment. The arrangement of the bodies in the center of the room seemed to form some sort of symbol, though no one could immediately make sense of it. It was as if the killer had intended to send a message, but what that message was, no one could say. As the days passed and the news of the massacre spread, the entire neighborhood was shaken to its core. Westwood, once a safe and tranquil community, had been forever changed. People began to stay indoors, locking their doors earlier than usual, afraid to venture out after dark. The streets that had once been filled with the sounds of laughter and life were now eerily quiet. There was no longer any sense of safety, no feeling of security that had once been a hallmark of the area. The fog that had rolled in that night seemed to linger, not just in the air, but in the hearts of everyone who lived there. It was as though the massacre had cast a shadow over Westwood that would never be lifted. The police, despite their best efforts, had no answers, no suspects, no motives, no explanation for the horrific crime that had taken place. They were left with more questions than answers, and the more they searched, the deeper the mystery seemed to grow. Eyewitnesses who had heard the sounds, who had seen the blood, were unable to provide any solid clues. No one knew who or what was behind the massacre. Some began to wonder if the events of that night were somehow connected to the earlier disappearances, to the strange, unsettling atmosphere that had gripped the neighborhood. Could it be that something had awakened in Westwood? Something dark, ancient, and powerful that had been lying dormant for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. The rumors began to spread quickly, and soon people were talking about things they had never dared to speak of before. Whispers of curses, of spirits trapped in the fog, of things that should never have been disturbed. But no one could say for sure. The only thing everyone knew was that the massacre had left Westwood irrevocably changed. The fear was palpable, and no one knew who would be next. And so, as the days turned into weeks, the people of Westwood were left to grapple with the horror that had descended upon them. They could feel the darkness growing, the weight of something terrible pressing down on them. But no matter how hard they searched, no matter how many questions they asked, the truth remained elusive, hidden in the shadows, just beyond reach. The massacre had only just begun, and no one knew how much worse it would get. The killings didn't stop. They kept happening one after the other in the same brutal fashion. Each disappearance added a layer of dread that clung to the people of Westwood like a suffocating fog. With every life taken, a shadow seemed to settle over the entire neighborhood, darker than the night itself, lingering in corners and spaces where no one dared to look. It wasn't just the fear of what was happening. It was the undeniable feeling that something else, something far worse, was at work here. As the days passed, the sense of calm before a storm deepened, leaving a pervasive unease in its wake. The murders were always the same, victims who had vanished without a trace. Their bodies found later, often disfigured and positioned in grotesque arrangements. Each time, it felt as if the killer's signature grew more sinister, more deliberate. There was no explanation, no motive that made sense, and no answers from the authorities. The police had their hands full, yet the killings continued unabated. Every new case sent the neighborhood into further turmoil. The people of Westwood, unsure whether they were safe in their own homes. With each passing day, the sense of danger escalated, and it seemed that no one was truly safe anymore. Not even the most trusted residents of the neighborhood were immune. Then, the strange things began to happen. At first, it was subtle. People started noticing shadows that didn't quite match the angle of the light. It could have been a trick of the mind, something anyone might dismiss after a long day. But it didn't take long for these unusual sights to become impossible to ignore. The shadows didn't stretch the way they should have. They moved differently, as though they had a life of their own. Residents would glance over their shoulders, only to see a shadow darting out of view, disappearing into the fog that seemed to cling to Westwood more tightly with each passing night. It was as if the shadows themselves were following the people who lived there, watching, waiting for something. At night, the whispers started. At first, they were faint, just the rustling of leaves, the distant murmur of conversations, the kind of sounds you might hear in any quiet neighborhood. But over time, they grew louder, more distinct. It was as though the air itself carried voices, the hushed murmurs of things that shouldn't be heard. Whispers in the alleys, whispers in the shadows. They seemed to come from places that were empty, places no one had any reason to be. People started to wonder if their minds were playing tricks on them, if the growing fear in the air was warping their perception of reality. But deep down, they knew this was something more than just fear.
People spoke of seeing things in the corners of their vision, figures standing just out of sight, always in the distance, always just beyond reach. They would disappear if you looked directly at them, but when you turned your gaze away, you would catch a glimpse of them once more, lingering in the corner of your eye. Some said it was just their imagination, that the stress of everything happening in the neighborhood was taking a toll on them. Others weren't so sure. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, something watching them, always just out of sight. The fear of the unknown gnawed at them, refusing to let go.
It wasn't just the residents who felt this growing unease. Even the police, who were doing their best to solve the string of murders, couldn't escape the strange atmosphere that had taken over Westwood. Officers who had once walked the streets with a sense of calm professionalism began to report feeling unsettled, unnerved by the growing darkness that seemed to permeate every corner of the neighborhood. Some of them even spoke of hearing voices in the night. Low, guttural whispers that seemed to seep from the cracks in the pavement, from the walls of the old houses that lined the streets. There was a sense that the very ground they walked on was saturated with something evil, something that had taken root in the soil of Westwood itself. As the days turned into weeks, the rumors began to spread. The whispers, the shadows, the figures. People started to speak openly about what they were experiencing. Some claimed the neighborhood was cursed, that the spirits of the victims were trapped, angry, seeking revenge for the brutal fates they had met. These spirits, they said, were restless, unable to find peace, and their anger was growing stronger with each new life claimed. The restless dead, they believed, had begun to haunt Westwood, looking for those responsible for their suffering. Others were not so certain. They believed there was something darker at work in the shadows. They didn't think it was just the spirits of the dead who were wreaking havoc on the neighborhood. No, they thought, It was something much more malevolent, something that thrived on fear, on pain, on death. Some spoke in hushed tones of a force, ancient and powerful, that fed on the terror that had taken over Westwood. This force, they believed, had been awakened by the murders, and it was growing stronger with each new disappearance. It wasn't just a killer on the loose. It was something far worse. Something that wanted to break free and claim the entire neighborhood for itself. Despite the growing number of disappearances and the increasing number of strange occurrences, life in Westwood continued, but it was no longer the same. The once vibrant neighborhood, with its tree-lined streets and bustling cafes, was now shrouded in a darkness that couldn't be shaken off. People were afraid to go out after dark, afraid to walk the streets they had once loved. There were rumors of people seeing figures standing in windows, staring out into the night, unmoving, unblinking. Some even reported seeing people who had been dead for days, their bodies twisted and contorted, standing motionless at the edge of their lawns, waiting for something. Those who dared to speak of what they saw were often dismissed, called paranoid or delusional. But as time went on, even the skeptics couldn't deny the growing feeling that something was terribly wrong in Westwood. It wasn't just the killings, it was everything else. The shadows, the whispers, the figures just out of sight. It was as if the entire neighborhood was slowly being swallowed up by something dark. Something that no one could see, but everyone could feel. And the worst part was that no one knew what it was or where it would strike next. The police, though they had more resources at their disposal, found themselves just as powerless as the residents. No evidence, no suspects, no explanation. The killings continued, and each one seemed to only deepen the mystery. As each new body was discovered, more whispers spread through the streets. More people saw things in the dark, more figures lurking just beyond the light. The night seemed to grow darker, the shadows longer. It was like the very fabric of Westwood had been torn, and something dark and terrible was seeping through the cracks. Whatever it was, it wasn't something anyone wanted to get too close to. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, became impossible to shake. People began to talk less, move faster, avoid looking into the shadows. They had all heard the stories, seen the signs, and felt the fear creeping in. They couldn't explain it, but they all knew one thing for certain. Whatever was lurking in the shadows of Westwood was not just a figment of their imagination. It was real, and it was growing stronger, and it wasn't going to stop until it had claimed them all. As the bodies piled up, the atmosphere in Westwood grew darker and more suffocating. The killings had begun to spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, and with every new body discovered, the sense of fear and confusion grew. It wasn't just the brutality of the murders that haunted the residents, but the inexplicable nature of the violence. No one knew who or what was responsible, and no one knew if they were safe anymore. The police had no leads, no suspects, and the bodies kept coming, each more gruesome than the last. The once quiet, peaceful neighborhood now felt like a place trapped in an endless nightmare. The people of Westwood, desperate for answers, began to look for any connection between the murders, anything that could explain what was happening. They spoke to one another, shared their theories, and began to dig into the history of their beloved neighborhood, hoping to find a clue, something that could make sense of the terror that had overtaken their lives. The more they searched, the more unsettling things became. At first, they started with the basics, the history of the neighborhood, the old buildings, and the people who had lived there before them. They visited the local library and scoured the town's archives, hoping to uncover some information that might shed light on the events that were unfolding. It was in these old records, buried deep within dusty boxes, that they made a chilling discovery. The area where Westwood now stood had not always been the thriving, peaceful neighborhood it was today. It had once been home to something far darker, a place that many had tried to forget. Long before Westwood had become a suburban haven for families and professionals, it had been the site of an old, abandoned asylum. The asylum had been built in the early 1900s, long before the area had been developed into the community it was today. It had stood on the outskirts of the neighborhood, its imposing walls and iron gates hiding secrets that no one wanted to acknowledge. The asylum had been the home to dozens of troubled souls, people who had been deemed too dangerous or insane to live among society. Some had been brought to the asylum by their families, desperate to find a place for loved ones who had become too much to care for. Others had been sent there by the state, victims of a society that didn't know how to deal with mental illness. At first, the asylum had been a place of healing, or at least that's what it was supposed to be. But as the years passed, the stories that began to emerge from the asylum painted a far darker picture. It was rumored that the patients there had been subjected to cruel, inhumane experiments, tests that were often dangerous and barbaric. The staff, who were meant to care for the patients, were said to be indifferent, even hostile. There were whispers of lobotomies, electroshock therapy, and other grotesque procedures, all in the name of finding a cure for the troubled minds that filled the asylum's halls. Many of the patients who entered never left, their deaths never recorded, their names forgotten. Some were said to have simply vanished without a trace, their bodies never accounted for, their stories left untold. As time went on, the asylum's reputation grew darker. The building itself became a symbol of horror, a place where the most vulnerable had been subjected to unspeakable suffering. The staff's treatment of the patients became increasingly cruel, and rumors began to circulate about the experiments that were taking place behind closed doors. Eventually, the asylum was shut down under mysterious circumstances. No one really knew the full story of why it was abandoned, but the official records were scant, and many believed that those in charge had something to hide. Some said the building had become too dangerous to maintain, while others whispered that the darkness of the place had seeped into the very walls. that it had become a breeding ground for madness itself.
The asylum was left empty, its windows boarded up, its doors sealed shut. Over the years, the neighborhood around it grew. The asylum became a distant memory, and life continued. But as the residents of Westwood began to dig into the asylum's history, they realized that something from that dark past had not been buried. It had returned, and it was angry. The more they learned, the more the residents began to connect the dots. The disappearances, the brutal killings, these strange shadows and whispers. Everything seemed to point back to the asylum. The victims of the murders were not just random strangers. They were members of the community. People who lived in the houses built over the asylum's grounds. It was as if the past had come back to claim them, one by one. The spirits of the patients, trapped in the asylum's walls, had been disturbed, awakened by something, and now they were seeking revenge. Some of the residents believed that the spirits of the asylum's victims were responsible for the killings. They said that the restless souls of the patients were angry, that they had been subjected to horrors that no one could imagine. And now they were taking their revenge on the living. The idea of vengeful spirits hunting down the descendants of those who had wronged them became a popular theory among the people of Westwood. They believed that the spirits were drawn to the places where they had once lived and suffered, that they had returned to finish what had been started long ago. Others, however, believed that it was not just the spirits of the dead who were haunting Westwood. They thought something far darker, something more malevolent, had been unleashed by the killings. Perhaps the experiments conducted at the asylum had not just harmed the patients physically. They had awakened something. Some said it was a curse, a force that had been lying dormant for years, waiting for the right moment to break free. And with each new murder, it was growing stronger, feeding off the fear and terror that was now running rampant through the neighborhood. No matter which theory the residents believed, one thing became clear. Westwood was no longer the quiet, peaceful place it had once been. It had become a battleground, torn between the living and the dead, caught between the forces of vengeance and the forces of something darker and more powerful. The history of the asylum had not been buried. It had simply been waiting, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise again. And now that it had resurfaced, no one knew how far it would go to claim its revenge. As the killings continued, the residents of Westwood were left with more questions than answers. They knew that the dark history of the asylum was somehow connected to the violence and terror that had taken over their community. But what could they do? The police were no closer to solving the murders, and the whispers of ghosts and curses had only made things worse. Some of them began to take matters into their own hands, desperate to find a way to stop whatever was haunting their neighborhood. They organized search parties, searched for any clues that could explain what was happening. But every lead they followed only seemed to take them deeper into the mystery. The darkness that had once been confined to the walls of the asylum had spilled out, and now it threatened to swallow everything. Westwood was trapped, caught
in a struggle between the past and the present, between the living and the dead. And as the bodies piled up, it became clear that no one knew who would be next, or if anyone could ever escape the nightmare that had descended upon them. The search for answers had only just begun, and no one knew where it would lead. But one thing was certain: whatever had awakened in Westwood was not finished yet. As the killings continued, the people of Westwood began to panic. Fear took root in every corner of the neighborhood. The calm that had once defined the area was long gone, replaced by an all-consuming anxiety that gripped every resident. No one felt safe anymore. Even during the day, the streets that once felt so familiar now seemed foreign, as if something unseen was watching from every shadow. At night, the fear became unbearable. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, their edges growing darker with each passing hour. The whispers grew louder, no longer just in the alleys, but in the homes, in the streets, in the minds of those who lived there. The police, overwhelmed and under-resourced, had no answers. The killings showed no sign of stopping. Each time the authorities thought they were getting closer to solving the mystery, something new emerged. An eerie clue, a missing person, a bizarre detail that only deepened the horror. The residents of Westwood no longer trusted anyone outside their small community. Everyone had become a suspect in their own eyes, and everyone feared the worst. In hushed conversations, some people even began to suggest the unthinkable. What if the killer was one of them? What if the person who had been hiding in the shadows, taking lives with such brutal indifference, was someone who had lived beside them all along? But as the days turned into weeks and the killings mounted, the fear was no longer just about the murders. It was about something else. Something ancient and malevolent that had taken hold of Westwood. People began to speak more openly about the stories that had been whispered in the neighborhood for generations. The strange occurrences in the neighborhood weren't just isolated incidents. They were connected. The asylum, the murders, the unsettling shadows, the whispers in the dark. Everything pointed back to one place: the abandoned asylum. The decision was made, though it wasn't easy. That final night, a small group of brave residents, tired of hiding and desperate for answers, decided to confront whatever had been haunting their streets. They could no longer live in fear. Armed with whatever they could find, flashlights, crowbars, and sheer will, they ventured toward the decaying building that had once been a place of horror. A place where unspeakable experiments had been carried out on those who were already broken. The asylum stood at the heart of the darkness, its stone walls looming over the town like a silent, oppressive sentinel. The night was thick with fog as they approached the entrance of the asylum. The air was colder than usual, a biting chill that cut through even the warmest of coats. The sound of their footsteps seemed amplified in the stillness, as if the building itself was listening, waiting. The doors of the asylum were old and rusted, creaking with every touch as they pushed them open. They stepped inside, the smell of mildew and decay filling the air. The dim light from their flashlights barely cut through the dark, and every creak of the old building seemed to echo in their ears.
Inside, the asylum felt alive in a way that was both haunting and suffocating. The walls, once white, were now covered in peeling paint and grime, their surfaces marked by time and neglect. Broken windows allowed the wind to howl through the halls, the sound of the outside world pressing against the silence within. The further they walked, the more the sense of dread grew. It wasn't just the oppressive atmosphere of the asylum that made their hearts race. It was the feeling that someone was watching them.
They made their way through the corridors, their footsteps heavy on the cracked floors. Every now and then, they would pause, scanning the dark corners, afraid of what they might find. But they kept going, determined to uncover the truth. As they reached the heart of the building, they found themselves in a cold, empty room. The air here was thick with the stench of decay. But there was something more, something intangible that made their skin crawl. In the center of the room were old medical instruments, relics of a time when the asylum had been filled with patients who had no hope of escaping. There were tables, chairs, and surgical tools covered in a thick layer of dust, but they still exuded an unmistakable sense of menace.
Then, on one of the walls they saw it. Strange symbols scrawled in dark, faded ink. The symbols were unlike anything any of them had ever seen. They twisted and turned in on themselves, looping in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. Some of them resembled symbols used in occult practices, while others seemed more like nonsensical ancient runes. The sight of them made their stomachs churn. It was as if the very walls were telling a story, one that had been written in blood. As they stood in the center of the room, the whispers began again. At first, they thought it was the wind, but the sound was too distinct, too deliberate. It wasn't the wind at all. It was voices, faint but undeniable, murmuring in the darkness. The group froze, their breaths shallow, as they turned to each other, searching for an explanation. But there was no time to talk. The shadows, which had always seemed to be a part of the building, were growing stronger now, closing in on them. The air felt thick, oppressive. They could feel the darkness pushing against them, pressing in from all sides. And then, something shifted. It was like the room itself was alive, and the building, once a silent tomb, had awakened.
Suddenly, one of them, the bravest among them, a man named Robert, stepped forward, his flashlight casting wild beams of light on the symbols on the wall. He reached out and touched one of the symbols. And that was when it happened. The floor beneath them trembled, and the walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The room grew colder, and the whispers became louder, rising into a crescendo. That was when they saw it. From the shadows emerged a figure, tall, twisted, and deformed, its features indistinct but chilling. It moved slowly, as if the very air around it was thick with malice. The group staggered back, their hearts pounding in their chests. But they couldn't look away. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to paralyze them with fear. The thing had no face, no clear form, just a dark, shifting shape that seemed to blur in and out of the light. It was as if it existed in the space between reality and nightmare, an entity born of the very darkness that had plagued Westwood. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared back into the shadows, leaving behind an eerie silence. The group, trembling with terror, tried to flee, but the room seemed to have changed. The doors were no longer where they had been, the windows sealed shut, and the air was too thick to breathe. The last thing anyone saw before the lights flickered and went out was the dark shape moving closer, the whispering growing louder until it drowned out everything else. And then, nothing. The final night ended in terror and mystery. No one knows exactly what happened to the group who entered the asylum. The authorities found no trace of them. No bodies, no sign of struggle, nothing. The asylum, once again, stood silent, its dark history buried in the shadows. The truth behind the massacre in Westwood remains a mystery to this day. Some say the spirits of those who suffered there still haunt the streets, waiting for their revenge. Others believe the nightmare is far from over, and that it will return once again, stronger than ever, as the entity that haunts Westwood grows more powerful with each passing year. So, next time you find yourself walking through the quiet streets of Westwood, remember, sometimes the past has a way of coming back to haunt you.